Good evening, and let's have another interesting discussion about dyslexia and other things. And the topic we chose for today was aphantasia and dyslexia. First question was,
We're not talking about a Disney movie.
I know, maybe like I saw that show. I'm like, no, that would be Fantasia. But this is just aphantasia. And we've got folks joining us as well. Christine David Lewis joining us from Trinidad. Always welcome to have you with us, Christine. I look forward to folks' questions as we go along. But curious, Stephen, I did some more research on aphantasia, and the term was coined supposedly like about 2015. But I was just curious, from your perspective, when do you first remember hearing of or learning of this term called aphantasia?
Well, I would say I've never heard of aphantasia. I've never heard of the term aphantasia. You would think that with all of the information that is out there, and being an advocate for children with learning disabilities, I mean, that's something that I would have ran across, but it wasn't, and I had to do some research on what it exactly is.
Yeah. Well, it hit some of the pop psychology articles. And just for our listeners and our viewers, aphantasia, by some definitions, is the lack of a voluntary ability to make mental movies in your mind, to picture things. In other contexts, they refer to it as not a lack of the ability to do it, but just not a conscious ability to know how to do it. And so they're really not quite sure, how do I make movies in my head? But if you ask somebody a question like, hey, well, think of what your childhood home looked like, or think about what your first pet looked like, or think about, for a guy, your first car, what it looked like, or for a girl, your first prom dress, or the first, piece of artwork that you really noticed before. And can you think about what that looked like and describe it to me with words? And that's a form of imagery. It may be static, and you're retrieving an image of a static object you saw, like a piece of artwork or a vehicle. But it also just talks in context of, can you really use mental imagery? And do you know that your brain actually is capable of making movies? And what I put in this discussion was, it's more of a difficulty in making mental movies, because from what I've read and from what I've studied as a neuropsychologist, cognitive psychology background, developmental neuropsychology background, every human brain is capable of making movies. The question is whether or not you know consciously overtly how to do it, and how to do it really well. Oh, sorry, Stephen, got muted on you.
Let's take a step back. That was a lot to digest, right? So describe to us, you're talking about making mental movies. Describe to us what that actually means and why that's important. Because, I mean, most people hear, okay, you can't make a movie. Okay,
Right.
we did, right?
Yeah.
But
Okay.
so I want the viewers and listeners to keep in their mind, we're talking about dyslexia. So the trouble of being able to actually read, be able to sound the words out. And now we're talking about, once you're able to read the sound or read the words, being able to hold on to that information and make this mental imagery. So take it away.
I will. And so let me throw up another image to talk from that comment you just brought up there, which is, here's the DSM-5, and here's the 3 criteria for diagnosing dyslexia. It's either a word reading accuracy problem, or it's a word reading fluency or speed of reading problem, or it's a reading comprehension problem. Those are the 3.
What does that look like?
So the word reading accuracy is a person of any age is reading along and they're misreading words, they're changing words, they're having trouble, thinking of words, and they are not accurately saying the words you actually see on the page. They might be substituting words, they might be omitting words, they might be they might be saying stream with the R in it, but the word actually written on the page is actually steam. So they've changed a single sound in a word. There's some degree of inaccuracy in the words you're reading on the page. And it can be measured at a single word level, and it can be measured at a whole sentence or a whole paragraph level as well.
So a question there is, that could also look like ADHD too, right? That particular piece, right? So I can remember, trying to read something really fast, and I look at the word, the first couple letters looks like a word that I knew, and it makes the word that I popped in my mind made sense, and I said that word instead of actually looking at the word and saying whatever the word was.
Well, typically ADHD won't cause the type of reading problems where you're changing out sounds of the word, like steam for stream, or you read the word through, but the word's actually though. ADHD is more inclined to cause you to either lose your place on the page or to drop out really small words. Linguists and the speech therapists usually call those words functors. Words like of, the, for, from, really tiny words, just kind of skipped over them. And then it's a little bit more of an aspect of you're really focusing on the content, but you're not really tracking efficiently and you're skipping some of the words. So rarely is ADHD seen as a causal factor of reading accuracy. Unfortunately, many schools are telling parents that. They're saying, well, your child doesn't really have a reading problem. He has ADHD. That's causing his reading problems. But if your child has changes where they're changing out sounds, changing out words, and their spelling is usually worse than their reading, that's not going to be attributable to an attentional deficit or difficulties with attention.
Okay.
So then the other part of the dyslexia diagnosis is reading comprehension problems. And the question becomes, okay, so what's the deficit there? Is it because you're misreading the words that's causing you to not understand what the story talked about? Or is there a different process in the brain that is really contributing to the comprehension problem in addition to the difficulty reading? And I spent 10 years as a stroke rehab scientist. And in that field of research, we were studying how do we help rebuild reading skills after brain damage. And here's what we found out. If the damage was closer towards the front up here by the eye, you're more likely to lose the ability to sound out words, but it didn't take away your ability to remember words you'd memorized, like yacht, though, somewhere, words that actually cannot be sounded out. If you sound out yacht, you go you say yachata, and you're not right. If the damage is a little bit further back from like a stroke, it's the reverse. You can't read the sight words, but you can sound out words. You can sound out pot, pot. You can sound out throage, you can sound out a nonsense word like throage because you're just sounding the words out. But if the damage is even further back, it doesn't change reading skills. It doesn't change spelling skills. It only changes comprehension. And so one question about the dyslexia diagnosis on the comprehension piece is it the reading skills that's affecting the accuracy of your comprehension, or could there be a secondary comprehension problem? And from the stroke research, we know that the comprehension system is separate from the reading and spelling system. From developmental psychology, we know that kids can comprehend what parents say around 6-8 months of age, even though they can't yet speak. And we know that because researchers have studied teaching children sign language at 6, 7, and 8 months of age. And many kids at those ages can learn 50 signs and they can't speak a single word. So that comprehension semantic knowledge system is actually building well in advance of the reading system. So they're separate but related systems.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, that's it's a lot to digest because, I mean, there's these, being able to hold on to that information after you've read it. And then you've been talking about the ADHD piece of it. And you're right. I mean, our school systems tend to mix these symptoms up a lot of times. And it's a catch-all. I don't know if I want to say a catch-all is the right terminology, but I would say a catch-all. I mean, it's what dyslexia was back in the 80s. You know, if you had any issues with reading or whatever, they just called it dyslexia, and they used it as an umbrella term instead of really trying to diagnose what it was, where your areas of deficit was, anything like that.
Yeah. So knowing that there's other research that says, hey, if you really want to pinpoint the prevalence of dyslexia, there's only two measures to compare. You take a student of any age, measure their listening comprehension skills. How well can they understand what they're hearing, what somebody is saying to them, and can they tell it back? Can they answer questions about it? Can they do higher level critical thinking, like infer, predict, conclude? And look and see what is that listening comprehension system proficiency at or skill level at, and then have them do a test of reading comprehension that requires the same degree of understanding, of answering questions, of doing infer, predict, conclude. And if your listening comprehension is higher than your reading comprehension, then the number one likelihood is reading is interfering with your comprehension because you're misreading words, you're making mistakes with words. And a research paper that came out of Florida State, I believe it was back in 2021 by Dr. Wagner in his laboratory there at Florida State. And he's done extensive decades of work on learning disabilities and dyslexia. They said the prevalence of dyslexia, if those were the two contrasting measures, would be about 1 out of every 3 people. So it can actually be much, much more higher likelihood, much more prevalent than people might actually think it is. But the question comes back to this aphantasia piece, but why? And asking us the question of the brain can reason, the brain can problem solve, but how does it do it? And so I challenge the viewers and listeners to ask themselves, how do you comprehend? How do you remember something? And let's throw up this quote real quick, Stephen, from Sheila. And she poses a personal experience that she had a traumatic brain injury about 5 years ago. And she told people, I still have the diary of what happened in my life. And I could read the entries and I remember what happened. I could write new ones, but I lost my photo album. Couldn't make my home movies anymore. I couldn't picture what was going on. And ironically, she even says she stopped dreaming at nighttime or really had no memory of any dreams anymore at all. And now here 4 or 5 years later, she's dreaming again. And if she concentrates, she can retrieve that imagery back again. And so what she's talking about is what we call an acquired disorder. It's an acquired aphantasia, which is due to brain injury. And we know commonly if that injury happens somewhere back here in the occipital lobes, it's more likely to result in that difficulty in making images or making movies. But even in post-stroke, thankfully, we know the brain can still rewire, rebuild the skills. And so that's what she's saying is whatever she's done over the last 4 years, whatever she's practiced and experienced and worked on has helped rebuild part of that imagery skill. In one of the brain imaging studies we did, we saw that even when a man had lost 2/3 of the left side of his brain, and he couldn't sound out words very well anymore, and he couldn't read very well anymore, in about 111 hours, we were able to rebuild his reading skills, even though there was no more brain tissue left on this left side of the language cortex. And we put him in a brain scanner and measured his brain activity. We saw the activity had increased on the right side, where the language skills normally be on the left. He didn't have that cortex anymore. But now we had new activity on the right side that matched where you'd expect to see the activity if you had a left side. So theoretically, our imaging data told us we had rewired part of the right hemisphere to take over the language skills, the reading skills, since the left hemisphere physically was gone. The brain tissue, if people don't know, when you have a stroke, the blood supply is cut off. That's the fuel that keeps the brain alive, and it's the fuel that fuels its working. If the blood supply is cut off, the brain tissue actually liquefies and is gone. Your brain will fill that cavity with spinal fluid just to keep the brain in a cushion of liquid. So the good news is, even if you think you have aphantasia, today it's not a clinical diagnosis. It's a description of behaviors. Is the brain still has the potential to rebuild and learn how to make images. And if it's aphantasia due to brain damage, the same thing still applies. The brain still has the ability to actually build more skills, become more proficient with it, and have that training. So
We have a question here from Yvonne. She said, if a child was misdiagnosed and placed on antidepressants, antipsychotic medication, which would cause more harm, and then after discontinuing medication, dyslexia emerges, what would that look like, or what would that be?
it's a challenging question, Yvonne. We appreciate you posting that, because typically medications don't cause any change to brain architecture. They're not going to change the brain wiring. They're not going to cause loss of synapses or loss of white matter fibers. It's just going to add a chemical to the brain that's trying to balance out the biochemistry of how the brain functions with those neurotransmitters. So it wouldn't be likely that medications actually cause a dyslexia, but it can be that somebody is having other anxiety or having other attention problems. And so it looks like a dyslexia, but it might be secondary to anxiety that may be related to some aspect of this treatment protocol. Like, what was the reason for the antidepressants or the reason for the antipsychotic to begin with? That might be something to explore more further. And typically, if you have a dyslexia, it's developmental. It's been happening for years up to that point. It doesn't have dyslexia, unlike other psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is most likely to happen around mid-20s, more likely in men. And that's usually when the first symptoms show up. That's not part of the diagnostic criteria of dyslexia. It's typically been showing up all along, and you've been struggling to some degree. And then it becomes even more prevalent as the loads or the requirement of reading skills gets higher and higher in school. So one way that you can actually verify whether or not there is any actual white matter fiber damage, they have a type of brain imaging called diffusion tensor imaging. It measures the white matter fibers, and even in a little tiny millimeter cubed of brain tissue, it can measure fibers going in 56 different directions. And it can create a whole map just of the brain white matter fibers or those neuronal cell bodies and their fiber connections, which are basically, I'm going to date myself now, the phone lines of the brain. I know that some of our viewers don't know what a phone line is because they've only had wireless phones and cell phones. But back in the day, your phone's plugged into the wall with a wire. And you had lots of wires running around. So that would be one way, or even just a standard MRI measures the brain structure to see, is there any change in just the cortex structure itself?
So I have a quick question. Going back to dreaming and being able to have the ability to make these mental imagery or mental movies. If you do have aphantasia, are you still able to dream normal?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because if you've got the imagery and you're using it a lot, if we think developmentally, imagery guides thinking before language does. The 2, 4, 6-month-old infant is recognizing objects, recognizing faces. In fact, a really fascinating laser eye tracking study was watching the pupil of an infant when they're face to face with their parent. The question was, when you get down in your baby's face and you say, "Hi, Sally, la, la, la," and you make the baby smile, the parent feels happy and the kid's smiling. The question is, where's the baby looking? You know, are they really just randomly scattered around your face with their eyes, or their eyes focus anywhere? And Dr. Lukowitz and his team, and I believe this was at FAU about 2012, they show that for 2, 4, 6-month-old babies, they're usually looking up here at the eyes. It's almost like a facial recognition first. So they're using visual information to guide their directed behaviors, which in some ways is early cognition. But around 8 months of age, many babies, majority of them, start watching the parent's mouth move. And when you look at the parallels between where visual focus is going and where language skills go, we know that most babies start babbling around 8 months of age. So it's almost to me as if they've been watching the parent's mouth move to figure out what their mouth should do. And then they start to try to move it, try to get it to work. And then usually mom's trying to say mama, say mama. And dad's saying, no, say dad, dad. And they're opening their mouths really big and you're going, dad, dad. Like, why do you do that? If you want them to say dad, why don't you just shout it in their ear so they hear you better? Well, it's because speech perception is not just an acoustic sensory experience. It's 4 sensory systems. It's part acoustic, it's part visual, but it's part oral tactile, which is touch, and oral kinesthetic, which is movement. So by the infant watching your mouth move and trying to move their mouths, and by mom and dad opening their mouths bigger and making bigger overt movements, you're giving the visual information that's actually guiding cognition and building language development for the infant.
Good answer. Well, I mean, you think about it. You've seen babies that are sleeping that smile, and they're really active when they. So I mean, obviously, I say obviously, I would think that they're dreaming. So they're sitting there thinking about, or you can see them kind of acting it out in their sleep. So we kind of got an idea of what aphantasia is.
Yeah.
How do we? If some of the listeners can they think that this is something that their child may have, how do they get tested for it? How do they know that this is the situation?
I'm going to put a link in the podcast right here because somebody's asking more about how do they know more about this? Can they get peer-reviewed research about it? We put this link on a lot of the posts for this podcast, but I'm going to add it right here to the podcast. This is a great peer-reviewed article just talking about defining and diagnosing aphantasia. Understanding, though, that aphantasia is actually not a clinical diagnosis. It's a description of behaviors and abilities that people have developed fully. So I'm adding that one to the podcast here. There's actually a questionnaire, and the paper I posted actually lists this questionnaire. It's called the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire. Now, the problem is it's a soft science kind of assessment. It doesn't have psychometric properties, which means it's not been vetted to say it's highly accurate at defining who has aphantasia and who doesn't. But it's one way to try to look at the concept of how well do you visualize things on a rating scale. So it tries to quantify this, internal behavior that we have happening. And that will give people one way to kind of begin to think about it, explore about it. But it's more of understanding you've got some kids or teens or adults who do really well with discussing and talking about what's happening with the information they heard or the information they read. But let's be really clear, which is your spoken language skills develop before your reading and spelling skills. So if you struggle to tell a story, then you've got a difficulty with your what we call expressive verbal language system. If you can't even verbally tell the story or tell someone, 5-step directions of how to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich, then you're also probably going to struggle with reading comprehension because even when you actually have the content, you struggle to get it out. So I want to differentiate between comprehension and expressive language skills. These are 2 big different sets of skills. And comprehension at the verbal level is listening comprehension. That system should be building first before we get to reading comprehension. And there's one thing that we want everyone who's viewing this podcast now, and the hundreds or 1,000 will see it later on. It is recorded. It'll be on the YouTube channel. We've got other questions about that. It'll be on the Instagram. It'll be on LinkedIn and Facebook. There'll be any place you want to. You can go and rewatch this at any time. We don't take them away. So if you want to understand how to help facilitate imagery, because the theory is anybody's brain is capable of building mental imagery skills, which means can you listen to somebody and make a movie of what they're talking about? Or can you read a book and make a movie about what you're reading? Or can you actually have a movie in your head that you want to put into words and explain it to somebody else? And probably one of the leading authorities on that topic, I'm going to pop up a book here, is a cognitive psychologist. It's the late Dr. Alan Pavio. Dr. Pavio spent most of his professional career studying mental imagery. He is the founder of a theory called the dual coding theory. And the dual coding theory, in this book called it Dual Coding of Mind and Its Evolution, he really explains how he got this verbal or nonverbal parts of the brain working together. Or it's not really good to say parts of the brain, 'cause it's not just right hemispheres, imagery, and left hemispheres words. It's more complicated than that. But just talk about that the brain has some verbal skills and the brain has some, imagery based skills. And so an easy way to look at his brain model is to look at this other image here. And basically, we're saying words can go into verbal systems, which can help you understand what you're reading just from the words. Like if I'm talking to you, Stephen, about computer systems, and with your background in systems engineering, systems administration, you don't need to make a movie to understand what I'm talking about. You live in that world every day. But if I'm going to talk to you about how an fMRI machine takes images of where the where the brain activity is based on blood oxygenation, I better give you a very clear, concrete description that helps build a movie in your head, because maybe you've never even studied this before, never heard of it before, and you have no existing knowledge base of it. I can help build a new knowledge base for you by being very picturesque and describing the movie for you. And that's this other part of Dr. Pavio's dual coding theory. Imagery is more of a nonverbal processing that helps you build an image, but the image can be, and that's what this arrow between the two, it can be connected back over to verbal. So you can actually see what's happening in verbal over here on the left side. So you want verbal skills to be able to go to movies, and movies to be able to go into verbal skills, which in simple terms means, can I make a movie of what you're saying? Or can I have my movie that I want to explain to you? And can I put my movie into words to help you understand what I'm talking about?
All right.
So here's another question for us, Stephen. It says, am I correct in remembering that I'm associated with the NOW program? Sorry, I thought I was picking up a different one. We may be receiving eligibility under IDA. I'm looking for the next steps. I got a mastery in education myself. Yes, I do own a company called Neurodevelopment Awards and NOW programs. It's involved in literacy programs. And actually, one of the programs that company has is called NOW Mental Imagery for language, comprehension, memory, and reasoning. And the reason that I put this book up here was to tell parents, if you start practicing with your kids now and making movies, you can actually help build better comprehension skills for your kids, for your teenager, for your 20-year-old, for your spouse. Because ironically, a lot of marital problems come from miscommunications. One spouse has an image at this level, but they jump into this image partway through, and the other spouse is not even sure what topic we're talking about. And they don't have the same image, and they're not on the same page. So we commonly tell people reading a book like this to help you understand more about imagery can help you actually be able to use imagery in just your daily interactions with your children. And the way to do it very simply is to say, hey, let's make a movie of what we're going to do tomorrow on Saturday. I'm picturing first we're going to grandma's house and we're going to take the black truck because I feel like driving the truck today. We're all piling in. We're going to throw the picnic basket in the back, and we're bringing the blue plastic picnic basket, that's the Yeti cooler style, not the brown, weaved basket, because it doesn't keep stuff cold. And then we're going to grandma's house. Then I picture us going over to the hardware store that's down the street from her. And you're kind of describing a movie of what we're going to do for the day. By just modeling imagery, you're making your kids consciously aware that the brain can make movies. Because schools don't teach this brain processing. Schools are more focused on content, and they're more focused on strategies. Well, the brain's not a strategy machine. It doesn't need more strategies. It's an information processing organ. So what we're talking about with Stephen and I today is aphantasia means somebody really hasn't given you explicit practice, training, or awareness of how the brain can actually make movies and how you can use them. And Stephen, you've seen more students do the imagery work. What are your thoughts about, even with your own boys? I think all three of your boys went through that NOW Mental Imagery course.
Well, it's actually just two of them did.
Okay.
My two oldest are my dyslexics, along with myself. However, it was interesting to me because I didn't have this issue as far as mental imagery. I was able to really had a good imagination and good processing and listening skills. So I didn't understand once my oldest went through NF and was now able to read at a high level, how he couldn't still answer a lot of the questions because he was still struggling with that mental imagery piece. And I actually sat in on some of his sessions just to see what it was about, just to understand kind of what was going on. And it really opened my eyes up to, this is the next, this isn't a missing piece, but this is the next building block to making sure that, we've secured this system here with reading. Now we're securing being able to hold on to this information and being able to use it, right? Because if we just are able to read it and we're not able to understand it and or be able to do something with that information, well, then reading it is useless.
Yeah.
So, Asher, he was one of the fastest to go through NF. The beginning program, the Now Foundations. But once he got to mental imagery, he slowed down considerably, and it was really eye-opening to see that, hey, there is a group of people that really need to have this skill built. I mean, so you were talking earlier about reading comprehension versus listening comprehension. And I mean, this is one of the arguments that I've gotten into with the school system quite often, because they keep telling me, well, there's no such thing as, there's only one comprehension. It's reading comprehension. Like, no, there's listening comprehension and there's reading comprehension. So if you're testing my dyslexic son, on his skill to read without any remediation on said skill, and you're telling me you're testing him on comprehension and it's reading comprehension, well, then by de facto, you're testing him on his disability. And if he hasn't been remediated, there's no way that he's going to be able to comprehend what he's reading. So what are we doing?
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's something that I have argued with the school system for years and years and years. So yes, you are 100% correct that our school systems don't understand, or maybe are unaware of, these are two completely different systems, and we need to make sure that we're developing these skills simultaneously.
Exactly. And here's another comment from Tanya, and I'm going to jump right to the middle of her comment where she says, she's always attributed her son's difficulty with comprehension to his autism and not to dyslexia. So let me clarify and say, dyslexia doesn't cause aphantasia. But one of the criteria of dyslexia is you might have a comprehension deficit. It's believed to be more due to the reading mistakes you're making, more so than this, language system towards the back part of the brain. Many kids with autism, though, are very literal in their comprehension. They don't get jokes. They aren't able to do figurative language, and they don't always see what's odd about a situation. And actually, that can actually happen with people who don't have autism too. You'll have some people who just, innately are less figurative, they're less creative, and they're more literal. And folks who have real significant comprehension problems many times will tell you when they're reading a book and they're trying to understand the book, they're trying to remember all the words they're reading and hold those words in memory. And when you ask them to retell the story, they'll be like very disjointed. Oh, it was a girl and there was a soccer game and something about a coach had an idea for, and the field was indoors, and they're like giving all these piecemeal parts, and they're just pulling together parts of the information, but they really can't get the whole concept and be able to explain the whole thing back to you. And so that could be a part of autism. We used to have the diagnostic differentiation to say, well, there's actually Asperger's. And Asperger's are the high functioning autistic individuals who really had more of these language comprehension deficits. Today, the DSM-5 just has one category of autism and all ranges of mild, moderate, severe in that one category. But it certainly can be a feature that's part of autism, and it can be a feature that's all by itself. We don't have a separate diagnostic criteria of language comprehension deficit unless it's so severe that it affects their performance on speech pathology testing, which would be a measure of, input or receptive language, and a measure of verbal expressive language. Speech therapists have a test, actually many different tests, but one example is it's the comprehensive evaluation of language fundamentals. And that self test is a measure of verbal speaking skills and listening, comprehension, and reasoning skills as well. They have another test that measures the metalinguistic skills, which is inference, prediction, just different types of linguistic concepts at a more high level. And if you are really more impaired in your comprehension system, your individual child, adult, or even your spouse or brother, anybody, it's not related to gender, SES, age, could have a language disorder. Language disorder means it has nothing to do with written words. It's only a verbal system processing difficulty.
Do you know if this is more prevalent in men than women?
I have not seen data that says it's more prevalent in one gender versus the other. All right, and let me clarify. Are you asking about aphantasia or the language disorder?
Aphantasia.
Yeah. I mean, one estimate was about 3 to 5% of the population have aphantasia. But because it's really not a diagnosis, it's not something that is readily assessed or even looked at from a speech therapy perspective or from even a clinical psychology or even in my field. Neuropsychologists are not commonly trying to diagnose or measure the ability to make mental movies because it's not a diagnosis. It's just a description of one of the brain's behavioral systems.
Okay. And the reason why I was asking that is, I mean, you were talking about marriage, right? And how not being able to communicate properly or effectively, obviously that causes marriage issues. And I mean, Amy, my wife, she could tell you a story and tell you everything. If she was describing, a discussion she had with somebody, she could tell you exactly what the person was wearing, when they were, where they're at, where it was sunny outside and the sun was coming in this direction on this day, on this time. She could tell you every detail about it. I mean, she's got a perfect mental imagery of it. Where I'm like, no, just get to the point. I need this much imagery, not the entire picture. And I'm wondering if that could be something that we're also looking at.
Yeah.
Where somebody who's dyslexic that probably did have issues in that same area, that's too much mental imagery for me at that point.
Right.
All I can take in is just a smaller amount of the information.
Well, and it's an interesting point you bring up because there's some groups who are out there pushing out these things about the superpowers of dyslexia. LinkedIn now has dyslexic thinking as a hashtag. There's no science that backs that up. That's just propaganda from a private group that they want to focus on some positives. And I get that. It's important to find positives for anybody. But there's no research that says everyone with dyslexia has these 5 strengths. But one of the strengths they talk about is mental creativity, more creative, more imagery based. And we know the brain is a system that builds skills in one way. It's called experience dependent plasticity. It means if you don't get the experiences, the brain can't build the wiring to develop the skills. It has to have the experiences to build the skills. So developmentally, we would say, if you're dyslexic and you're severely impaired in reading and you've got to learn the content from your teacher in history class and you're in grade 2, you might pay real close attention when she's talking and you're actually practicing making movies as she's talking because it was already a skill you'd actually started to develop and now you're developing it even more. And then if you keep practicing those skills in grade 3 and grade 4 and grade 5, you're actually, through experience-dependent plasticity, you're building your imagery skills. You were not genetically endowed with those skills. If we really wanted to test this belief or this, personal focus on the 5 strengths of dyslexia, we would go look at 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, and we'd measure their language comprehension skills of verbal language and measure their vividness of imagery skills at age 4, 5, and 6 before they get the big reading gap. And if both kids have about the same verbal language skills along with their IQ, then we would say, yeah, there's no evidence that they were genetically born with better mental imagery skills. they couldn't read, so they spent less time reading and more time making movies as a way to compensate and try to succeed and be successful in learning the material. But
The way I describe that is for all of our parents out there is I talk about it from survival skills.
yeah, exactly.
You know, those of us that struggled really bad at school, K through third, fifth, whatever, we are building these survival skills because we're put in an environment and we're asked to do things that at that point in time we're physically not able to do because of the deficits that we have. So therefore, we're, like you said, we're honing that listening skill because you talked about history. History was one of my best subjects. Science was one of my best subjects because the teachers lectured a lot. And I enjoyed listening to what they were saying. So I could take the information, memorize it all for what you said. And my teachers used to get angry at me because I would pass their tests.
Yeah.
But I couldn't pass the homework because the homework wasn't on what they were lecturing on.
Yeah.
They're
And
like,
you
well,
don't learn what they said because you didn't read the chapters.
Right.
Yeah. And so here's a question that goes along with this, Stephen. This is from the remarkable educator, Miss Stacy Gould. And Stacy's in the country of Trinidad and Tobago, works with some really tough populations of helping kids empower themselves. And she wants to know if we're going to train mental imagery, about how long does it usually take to get these to an independent level of functioning? And that's kind of a crystal ball question, but because we've been doing this with the company nowprograms.com for about, since 2013, that company's been offering mental imagery training online for students of any age. And our typical duration is going to be somewhere between about 120 and 180 sessions. But there's multiple factors that affect how long it's going to take, which is, how old are you? How big is the gap? Do you have a language disorder in addition to this trouble with the imagery skills? Do you have ADHD in addition to this? It's like, how many difficulties are there? And are there small gaps or large gaps across each of these difficulties? So when we're doing these kind of work online through nowprograms.com, they're doing imagery training and they're moving at the pace of the student themselves. So it could be as few as 80 hours, like Stephen's son did when we were really remediating his dyslexia with that Now Foundations program, the other online course. But it could be more than 180 hours if it's more severe. Now, related to that is Christine is also asking a question about a student that she's working with. And Christine David Lewis is also in Trinidad, and she's working with a student who has autism. She's really trying to build his imagery skills. And she's been trained in an imagery program. She's utilizing that program. He gets the beginning, he gets the end, but he kind of forgets the middle of the movie. So just think of the brain as a information processor and know that sometimes it needs more refreshing of the image. So if you're doing a sentence at a time, and by the time you get to the end of the story, they've lost part of that movie, then it may be that we need to review that movie sooner. Oh, sorry, that didn't mean that one. And we want to be sure, okay, let's do 2 sentences, make the movie, do a 3rd sentence, go back and retrieve the whole movie, do a 4th sentence, go back and retrieve the whole movie, and start doing that whole movie imagery retrieval in small successive chunks, as opposed to doing 1 sentence, a 2nd sentence, a 3rd sentence, a 4th sentence, and then trying to retrieve the whole movie. It may be too much information to retrieve, and the volume of the movie is too large. It's kind of like saying you have to build up that capacity, build up that amount of imagery you can create and store, and refreshing it more frequently strengthens that imagery as well.
So as we're talking about building that image or that movie in your mind, there's a lot, and I've heard this a lot in the school systems, where the reading teacher will talk about building the photo. And you and I have had long discussions about this many times. So talk about the difference in, you talked about reading those paragraphs or reading those sentences and creating the photo versus creating the mental movie in your mind.
Yeah. What we know about the brain imagery is that the stronger the image and the more information packed it is. It's that old cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Yeah, but a movie's worth 1,000,000. So you don't really want a static picture. You want a movie because To use our VCR DVD terminology, you can fast forward, you can rewind, you can zoom in, you can pan out and see more of the movie. And so by having a really detailed mental movie that really is a motion picture of imagery, you're going to store more information more efficiently and retrieve more of it as well. And if you retrieve one part of the movie, since it was a whole motion picture anyway, it makes it easier to rewind back to something or fast forward. And it also allows you to step back and infer, predict, deduce, conclude, extrapolate in many different ways of higher level reasoning skills. So that imagery should not be what you see in the newspaper on the Sunday is the comics, or there's a photo, there's a scene, because that means you retrieve one scene, it really wasn't connected to the others. It doesn't help you retrieve the others as well. But if you actually have a mental movie in your head, you retrieve, retain, and store more information. Here's another great classic example. We'll ask people, hey, what's the last TV show you saw? Just something fun. And they'll be like, oh, I watched, Friends. I was watching reruns. I watched a rerun of Friends. Like, was it a good episode? Like, yeah, I loved it. Laughed and laughed and laughed. Said, okay, you loved it. You're focused on it. You're attentive to it. Can you tell me every word each actor and actress said in the first 5 minutes? Not a long, just 5 minutes. And most people say to you, no, that's ridiculous. I can't do that. Like, well, could you tell me what happened in the first 5 minutes? Like, oh, yeah. Like, well, but wait a minute. You forgot all the words. How do you know what happened in the show? Well, you're able to retrieve the movie you just watched on TV, replay that movie in your head, and talk back the sequence of events that you actually saw physically with your eyes. That's one type of imagery where the imagery is actually being provided to you. That's more visual memory, storage of somebody else's movie. Not quite the same, but is related to you creating your own movie. But it helps parallel why it's so inefficient to try to remember the words somebody says or try to remember all the words you saw on the page is not going to work as well for long-term storage, higher level reasoning skills as a mental movie will to empower your skills and abilities.
I mean, so even going down that same logic, not every word that you read is important, right? So
Exactly.
You think about taking a test, and they give you the paragraph to read, or 2 paragraphs to read, and you start reading through it, and about 90% of whatever you're reading really is irrelevant because they only want to know one sentence or information from one sentence. So, when you're building that mental imagery, like you said, it allows you to compress or hold on to that larger amount of information in a way to be able to answer the questions or use that information. So
Exactly. And Amy Gluff Rowland has a question because her daughter has dyslexia. And she noticed her daughter also struggles with vocabulary, which is a really good question. Because the question is, well, vocabulary is you're storing a word by its sounds and you're storing the content with the word as well. When you hear the word again or you see the word again, you're able to retrieve the content. So there's 2 parts to vocabulary. It's part phonological. It's the sounds that make up the word. Pusillanimous is a big SAT word. And you have to be able to remember that word in its spoken form as well as in its written form to be able to answer questions about it on the SAT test. And if you don't know what pusillanimous means, you think of Wizard of the Oz and you think of the different characters in Wizard of the Oz. And there was this lion, and he was called the Cowardly Lion, but they could have called him the Pusillanimous Lion because pusillanimous is just a big $100 word for the word cowardly. So vocabulary is part phonological. So Amy's daughter has gone through that now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling program, which it's an evidence-based program to build better phonological perception, phonological awareness, auditory memory. But then you need the imagery to pair with it as well to actually begin to build better vocabulary. So her question is, if her daughter then does that now mental imagery program for language, comprehension, memory, and reasoning, would she expect to see her daughter's vocabulary improve? And the answer would be absolutely, because now you've actually empowered 2 systems in the brain. Theoretically, the imagery is more right hemisphere, The phonological word base is more left hemisphere. And these two are now stronger, so they can work together to store the meaning of the word, to retrieve the meaning of the word, to retrieve the word itself, and be able to use it in speech, and also to be able to understand it when somebody else is saying it.
So I'll tell you the thing that was so astonishing to me when Asher went through mental imagery. Asher was the type of student that if it was read the paragraph and then write a sentence about what you wrote or you read, if he could use a 1 or 2 word sentence, I know that that's not a sentence, but if he could use 1 or 2 words to answer what it was, that's all you got.
Yep, that's it.
If you asked him to write a paper about what it was that he read or a topic, I mean, it was 1, maybe 2 sentences, and that was it. That was the extent of it. He was in mental imagery for probably a month, and he had come. He was in English 2, so he was a junior. He came back to me and he said, "Hey, Dad, can you proofread my paper that I wrote?" Handed it to me, and it was, it was probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 paragraphs. I mean, good size paper for him. I read first. I looked at it, and I looked up at him, and I looked at it again. I was like, "Oh, come on, man!" And I read it. And I looked at him. I go, "Did you write this?" And he goes, "Yeah, I wrote that." And I go, "No, you're not understanding what I'm saying. Did you write this? You didn't do this. You didn't have any help writing this. Is what I'm asking." And this was, before all the kids started understanding what ChatGPT was.
Yeah.
And he goes, "No, Dad, I wrote it." And I was blown away. I looked at him. I was like, "Asher, this is amazing."
Yeah.
I mean, it completely unlocked his ability to write an actual paper that he could turn in. And to keep going on that a little bit more, we had a 504 meeting, and we were sitting in there. And I have to tell you, after going through NF and NMI and getting to the point where we go into our 504 meeting, and there's no fighting going on in the 504 meeting. There's no back and forth. You're not doing this. Y'all aren't doing, my child's this, my child. There's none of that. It was the most amazing meeting that I've ever had the experience of having in a school, because that we walked in, the counselor and the teacher's like, "Oh, he's doing great. He's one of my top students." The English 2 teacher said, "If you hadn't told me that your son was dyslexic, I would have never known. And he's one of my best writers." I was like, this is what it's supposed to be like.
Exactly. That's what you and I talk about. That's what remediation is. You've strengthened the skills so much that the gap no longer exists. And it's really important for the adults listening or watching this podcast who've had learning difficulties. Cassie mentions that she has aphantasia and has always struggled to picture things or make movies, and discussing it with her dad who's in his 70s. He's like, "Yeah, I don't make movies either." But helping the adults like Cassie know that, this is a skill that can be changed and trained at any age. Just like you could be, 70 years old and still not good at sounding out words, we know that you can actually change your phonological awareness. We can strengthen your decoding skills so much so that you no longer meet the criteria for dyslexia. Now, let me be really clear before people light me up and tell me things like, it's a neurological disorder. Like, well, I am a neuropsychology brain scientist who's peer-reviewed, published in a lot of neurological conditions. So I do understand the neurology of the brain. What we're saying is dyslexia is diagnosed by behaviors, not by genetics. So we can change your behavioral skills so much that you don't have a gap in your reading accuracy. If there's no more gap in your reading fluency, and if there's no more gap in your reading comprehension compared to your IQ skills, and you're really functioning at your IQ level, then by definition of the DSM-5, and I'll put this back up again, you do not meet criteria for dyslexia. If none of these 3 difficulties exist, reading accuracy problems reading fluency problems or reading comprehension problems, you cannot be diagnosed with dyslexia. So we want Cassie to know, yeah, absolutely, Cassie, the brain's capability to build new skills is lifelong. There's only one point when I cannot train new skills in a human brain, and that's called death, because there's no more function happening. Until death, the brain's ability to make new wiring, build new wiring, learn new skills is always possible, and it depends on 6 elements. First, not even in those 6, is the treatment program scientifically tested and proven to be highly effective? That's what we call evidence-based from a medical healthcare perspective. Then what's the intensity of the instruction, which means how much time per day? What's the frequency of instruction, which means how many days per week? How specific is the instructional steps? It's got to be very specific to facilitate faster learning. And what is the developmental hierarchy of the training? Basic skills first. So when you're training mental imagery, we actually start with objects and have you looking at an object, and you learn to give us the details of what is it, color, size, shape, number, attributes that really make that object concrete and easy to picture. We'll then use pictures. We'll then use sentences. We'll use multiple sentences. And so we'll build up a developmental hierarchy. And then the 5th thing is actually more important than the first 4. You can do those first 4, but if you don't do it long enough, which is back to the question that Stacey Gould asked, which is how long does it take? Well, it's got to be long enough until that process becomes automatic. And that is dependent on the individual's range of deficits and range of strengths. Some people build those imagery skills faster. Some people take a little bit longer. But the brain, every human brain, has the potential, even if you have autism, has the potential to build better imagery skills, to facilitate better spoken language, better listening comprehension skills, better reading comprehension. And here's something, Stephen, we haven't touched on, but you just described it with your son. Part of the use of imagery is making sure that when you write a sentence, the words you choose to write are clearly organized, clearly descriptive enough that they will build a movie in the reader's brain. If you write the grammatically correct sentence, I saw the thing next to the place down by the stuff. That is a perfectly grammatically correct sentence. And if I punctuate it and capitalize it, I'm golden. I've met all the grammar rules. But in terms of comprehension, it's like I have no idea what to picture. The words, the nouns, the verbs are all too vague. But if you wrote the sentence, the small white poodle walked down the brown, dusty road next to the green, grassy field while the orange sun was setting and glowing orange on top of the green grass. Then I've given you colors and size and shape, and there's been movement in there, and I'm building an image. So imagery really is one of the most powerful skills to train at the spoken level first, and then generalize it to the written level second. It then helps build better writing skills for students of any age as well.
I was just seeing the poodle in the setting sun.
Well, and to make sure people understand, this is not a promo podcast. Somebody asked about the Now programs. It sponsors this podcast. So someone's now asking, how do we get training? I'm going to put the link to the online training program. But you can actually build mental imagery yourself without buying services from one of our companies. If you just practice picturing things in your mind, listen to an audiobook, try to visualize the first couple minutes of it, pause it, give yourself time to really kind of picture it and make sure you can see it, and then think about it, get a clear image, and then let the book play a little bit longer and image it, and let the book play a little bit longer, and then stop, and then try to retrieve the movie you've been making so far. Try to make sure that words you're saying are more concrete, more clear, using more descriptive terms. You can build imagery all by yourself just by listening to audiobooks or even practicing it with the friends you're having conversations with. Try to build that imagery skill, make that movie, think about the color, the size, the shape, what angle is your camera looking at it from? Is it top down? Is it side straight on? Is it bottom up? You are the actual producer, director, and you are the camera that's watching and taking this movie in all together. Stephen, this podcast session has blown by. I hope folks found it fascinating and informative. But why don't you give us a wrap up on aphantasia and dyslexia? And I'll give one science piece again. The podcast was not saying that everyone with dyslexia has aphantasia. That's not what we said. We said, let's talk about aphantasia because one of the criteria is that there's a comprehension problem. So we want to make sure that people know there can be comprehension problems separate from the reading problems, or the two can occur together. And this dual coding theory by the late Dr. Alan Pavio really spent 6 decades studying how the brain makes imagery and uses words or uses movies for thinking, learning, memory, and reasoning.
I would like to wrap up by telling our parents it's the same advice I tell them all the time. Number one, when you hear these type of things that we're talking about, ask more questions. Keep asking questions till you get an answer that you can truly understand what they're saying. And somebody can truly articulate what it is that you're dealing with. Don't just take that first, well, it's like I said, it's ADHD, what we were talking about earlier, where we're talking about ADHD. Oh, it's just ADHD. Or it's your kid's not concentrating, or they're being late. Ask more questions. Make sure that you're out there seeking this information to educate yourself, so you can make sure that you're getting your child the best help that they can get.
And that gives us the best chance to make the most progress.
100%.
So, folks, that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us for this podcast. It's going to be taped. It is taped. It's going to be recorded, immediately available on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on all the other social media platforms that we're streaming out on tonight. And we look forward to the next conversation. In 2 weeks, we'll be back with a new topic. Next week, we have another podcast running. That's Dyslexia Success Stories. That's at noon every other Friday. And we'll be talking to someone who's actually successfully gone through interventions to change their reading and spelling problems, that change their comprehension problems, or their written composition problems, to have more information about how the brain can build these skills, will build these skills if you use scientifically tested and proven programs. So thanks for the time. Stephen, always a pleasure to have this conversation with you and dialogue back and forth about these great concepts and share that brain science and advocate kind of knowledge base with our listeners and viewers.
Thanks, and y'all have a great week.